you when you're ready. Jeopardy music. Right. Your mic's still on. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Is this mic open? Is this ready? I have a question. Were we supposed to be able to hear her over the speaker? Yeah. Okay. Four. There is that one right somewhere. Almost there. Welcome to tonight's April meeting of the Raleigh Astronomy Club. Our speaker tonight is longtime club member Phyllis Lang, and her topic is astronomy with binoculars. So hand it over to Phyllis.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see you, and thank you for coming out to hear this talk about doing astronomy with binoculars. So probably the first question we need to address is, why in the world should I be talking to you about this? After all, probably my journey with astronomical observing is somewhat like yours. How many folks in the room own binoculars? And how many folks in the room have used those binoculars to look at the night sky? Most everybody. Well, that's great, because there will be some introductory material, but there will also be some material for people to learn how to do some new tricks with binoculars, maybe introduce you to some techniques and resources you may not know about. So my observing journey began back in July of 1969. And at that point in time, I was really enthralled with the astronauts going to the moon. So I watched all that stuff. And during their trip, I decided that the moon really should be a cool place to look at, but my family didn't have a telescope. So I realized that there was a pair of family binoculars in a drawer, so I absconded with them one night, went out in the yard, pointed them up at the moon, and realized that the moon was shaking violently. So it took a while for me to realize that if I were to lay down in the grass, and this was July, so the grass is nice and warm, it's warm outside, warm breeze. Gee, I can remember it like it was yesterday. I laid down in the grass and I balanced the binoculars on the orbits of my eyes and held them steady enough, but not firmly. And that made the view quite a bit better. And I looked for a good while and was truly astonished at what I saw just in the family binoculars. So that was my first astronomical observation back in good old 1969. So if we fast forward, about 25 years, at that point in time, I had a telescope. I had a C8, and I had used it just about every clear night I could get it out. But I had noticed with a number of different comets I had tried to look at with that telescope that I could see the nucleus of the comet and maybe a little bit of the tail, but the field of view in the telescope was so small that it wasn't the most impressive view. And I began to hear from other members of the club that binoculars really might be a great thing to use if looking at a comet. So over the last 20 years, I have learned to use binoculars, not only on comets, but also on deep sky objects. And that need arose from our family camping trips, where you stuff all the kids and their toys and the camping gear in the car, and one telescope would fit, but certainly not both of our telescopes. So I learned to come out with the binoculars and a mount. And so that's when I really learned to do deep sky observing with the binoculars. And in fact, I earned the Astronomical League Binocular Messier Award somewhere in there. It's been several years now. So those first two little bullet points, I probably shared those experiences with a number of you. But this last point is a little unique. And that is that, as many of you know, I write software for astronomers to use to plan what they want to observe. And as a part of that work, I publish observing lists about once a week. And at least once a month, I publish a list specifically for binocular observers. And for the last few years that I've done that, I've come to find various resources online. And I've gotten sort of intimate with some of these lists and the objects that seem to pop up on these lists from place to place. So that has sort of made me much more keenly aware of binocular observing and the resources that people can find online and in print. So, of course, many of us in here use telescopes. But why would we use binoculars? And this is really pretty straightforward. As we saw a moment ago, most people have binoculars, and you probably know how to use them. So if you want to go outside with binoculars, it's a no-cost startup solution. You just go out. They're very portable, and this can be an extremely important thing, especially if you're at home, tired, kids have homework, dinner's late, blah, 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 and you just want to get out and have a quick look at something interesting in the night sky. It could be a comet, or it could be the moon, or what have you. All you have to do is pick them up and go out. They're just completely portable, so there's no setup time involved. And in our hurried lives, of course, that can be rather useful. It turns out that binoculars are surprisingly useful. You don't have to have a telescope to see an awful lot of things in the night sky. Now, there are plenty of things in the night sky that require a telescope. They're too dim or too small to be seen really with binoculars, but there are a surprisingly large number of objects that look great in binoculars. And in fact, binoculars are the instrument of choice for a lot of things like comets and the larger deep sky objects. So many of us have binoculars. What kind really work? And the answer is just about any kind work. And of course, the better the optical quality, the better view you'll get, the better they will perform for you. The better the mechanical function of your binoculars, the better you'll be able to focus them and so forth. So just about any binocular will work, but the better they are optically and mechanically, the better they'll perform. So first and foremost, when you're working with these binoculars, you absolutely need to learn how to get a sharp, focused view. Some binoculars have one focusing mechanism and others have two. So you'll need to figure out with your particular pair of binoculars what it takes to get them focused, because that is key. Another thing, I have a pair of binoculars here, and usually on the end plate of the binoculars, you'll see a number. These are showing 7 by 50, 7x50. And what that means, this was a mystery for me for years. The 7 by 50, or in the slide 8 by 50, 8 is the magnification of the optical system. Not only the front lens, but the eyepiece. The entire system delivers 8 power magnification. The 50 is the aperture, the diameter of these front lenses. So that's important. I'll refer back to this slide as we go. I call this the 3 bears slide. because it shows 3 different sets of binoculars we happen to have around our house. We have the Papa Bear binoculars, the big 16 by 70s, and we have the Mama Bear 7 by 50s. Those, that's a very common size for people, a very medium, easy to hold size. And then the little sport binoculars, we have the 10 by 25s. Now, of these binoculars, we would definitely use the Daddy Bear and the Mama Bear size. The sport binoculars are usually not used. They're more often seen over at the PNC Arena watching basketball games. And I suppose we don't use them mostly also because we have the other ones. So back to the magnification issue. Let's all just agree that the eye alone, with no optical aid, has a magnification power of 1x. So if we can agree on that, and if we have an 8 by 50 pair of binoculars, they have a magnification of 8x, which means the objects that you view through them look 8 times bigger than with the eye alone. Okay. So the nice thing here is that the magnification makes the object look larger, and therefore you will see more detail. If you're not understanding what I mean, think about your smartphone and the camera function. Maybe you turn on the camera function, you look through the viewfinder, and if you zoom the camera view, you'll notice that objects get larger. So that's what we're talking about. The aperture of the binoculars, they're like any optical instrument. The larger the aperture of the lenses, the more light is delivered through the system to your eye. This is really the key feature of any astronomical instrument. This is more important really than power. Aperture is the key thing because of all the light it delivers to you, to your eye. So it turns out that the human eye, the diameter of your pupil, dilated, fully for darkness, the diameter is about 7 millimeters. Now that can be smaller the older we get, but generally 7 is a pretty good average for most people when they're fully dark adapted. So if you compare that to the 8 by 50 binocular example, we'll do the area of a circle formula where we have the radius of the 50 millimeter binocular is 25, and then square that. And then the radius of the dilated eye is 3.5 millimeters squared. You divide that, you come up with about 51. So the average 8 by 50 binocular is delivering 51 times more light to your eye than the unaided eye alone. So that's key. You're going to be able to see dimmer things here. That magnification is going to allow you to see smaller things in greater detail. The bad news is that the increased aperture of binoculars means more glass, and glass is heavy. So the larger aperture of your binoculars, the heavier they are, and the more difficult they are to hold still. So, back in 1969, the very first time I ever looked through binoculars at the sky, I realized there was a lot of shake going on. So binoculars and shakiness, unfortunately, go together. The magnification in those binoculars is amplifying the natural shake in your hand. So you're going to have to do something to stabilize that. Now, if you've ever looked through your cell phone camera and you have zoomed that view out, you've zoomed it, and you'll notice that when you take pictures very often with a zoomed camera, the image is blurry, and that's because of this shaky thing. So there are several tricks we can use to stabilize the binoculars so they won't shake. Of course, I've already mentioned if you're lying on the ground, you might balance those on the orbits of your eye and hold them, not firmly, but steadily, and that will help to damp out the shake. The thing I do more these days is I use my elbows as sort of a brace. Now, a lot of people will put their elbows up against the front of them and they'll look and hold the binoculars steady. The problem with that is, well, you're not going to get very high up in the sky that way. So what I have found useful is to brace the elbows on something steady, like a car or a fence post or a mailbox post or what have you. That has worked real well for me. I saw something recently in the March issue of Sky at Night magazine, an ingenious solution to this problem. And the author of this article went and got a window squeegee with a telescoping pole. He wrapped a towel around the head of the squeegee. He put his binoculars on top of that and then bungeed them on with 2 cords. So all, out of things he had in his garage, he suddenly had a monopod that was adjustable to hold his binoculars steady for him. I thought it was ingenious. I will leave that article available up here for you to look at after the talk if you'd like to have a look at his idea. Other things you might do to help with the shake issue, and that's a camera tripod. Many of us have those. And the other thing that you might try is image stabilizing binoculars. Mike Mantini, are you here? Okay, so Mike isn't here tonight, but in January, the club was out observing one night. We were looking at Comet Lovejoy. And I had my big Fujinon binoculars on the mount, and I had been looking. And I invited Mike over to have a look through mine, and he says, yeah, that looks great. Here, try these. So he hands me his image stabilizing binoculars. And I thought, well, the way my hand's shaking, this isn't going to be very good. So I poked it up at the sky, looked at Comet Lovejoy, and was astonished at how well those things work. They are shockingly effective. So if you can, if you can come up with the money for image stabilizing binoculars, they are an excellent instrument. So if you have the need to mount the binoculars, this reduces the portability, but it certainly mitigates the shakiness problem. There are 2 solutions. If you want to put your binoculars on a camera tripod, you're going to need something called an L bracket. This is an L bracket, and I will leave it up here for everybody to have a look at if you're not familiar with them. You'll need one of these to attach your binoculars to a camera tripod. The other solution is a parallelogram mount. And this is something that's available both commercially and do-it-yourself. If you Google parallelogram mount, I think you'll find full plans for building your own. You'll find a few dealers who sell them commercially. I use a parallelogram mount just about every time I take the big binoculars out. And my mount will show up in a picture in a few minutes. So first, we have the camera tripod and the L bracket. These are my big binoculars, and here's the L bracket. It screws in, and this is shown better in the next photo, but it screws into the binoculars here and into the head of the tripod mount here. Tripod head, I guess, yeah. So another view, you can see where this screws into the front of the binoculars themselves. Your binoculars are going to need to have a threaded hole there. Not all binoculars do. Larger binoculars seem to generally have that. And then the bracket goes down into the head of the tripod here. Now, with this arrangement, I have to adjust azimuth by rotating here. And I have to adjust altitude here. There's a handle sticking out here. Excuse me. And so that's my altitude and azimuth adjustment, and this is yaw. I guess that's the right term, yaw. The problem with all this is that those binoculars are kind of heavy, and it turns out that that method of adjusting your targeting is not really great on heavy binoculars. When I first got these binoculars, I had gotten the L bracket at the same time. So as soon as binoculars came and it got dark, I took all this outside, put the photo tripod up, put the L bracket on, put the binoculars on, and within 5 minutes I realized this was not the solution for me, not with those binoculars. Smaller binoculars, I think they'd be fine. So the other solution you might find is this parallelogram mount. Now, I've had this mount for at least 20 years, and it has worked beautifully for me. We have a fairly tall homemade tripod. Mark had built a tripod for some telescope and had stopped using it. So he made a new little tripod head for me to use in an hour or two one afternoon. And I screw the base of the parallelogram mount in through here. So this is my azimuth axis. That's where I adjust my azimuth. And the altitude is adjusted here. So there are my two motions. And this arrangement is the parallelogram and counterweight. So the beauty of this counterweight thing is that I can adjust the mount to hold the binoculars on any target, and the counterweight system will hold it steady for me. And the other thing that's wonderful about a parallelogram mount is parallelogram arrangement allows you to point the binoculars at your target. And at my house, this is super important because I'm 5.5 feet. So I get my target in the binoculars. Mark comes along and he wants to look. All he has to do is push the entire arrangement up. The targeting doesn't move. So we can share views this way without him having to grumble around on the ground or me to have to stand on a ladder or something. And it's great for public also. I have had these binoculars out for public observing, and being able to just adjust it upward and downward for any size customer is a nice feature. So here again, you can see how these binoculars are attached to the L bracket of the parallelogram mount with a threaded 1/4-20 bolt is really what it is. So now that we have all the hardware discussion out of the way, let's talk about what we can see. And the answer to the question of what can I see is quite a lot. There really is quite a lot that you can see. You don't really have to have this big expensive telescope to see everything in the nighttime sky. There's plenty available, as we'll see, to binoculars. The caveat, I guess, with just about any observing pursuit is that the darker your observing location, the better. Light pollution is just bad for all observing except for maybe the sun. So you need to find the dark corner of your yard or the dark corner of the campground or whatever to get the best views. This is the standard warning slide that goes with all observing talks, and that is do not observe the sun with binoculars. Even binoculars, do not do it. If you look through binoculars at the sun, you can damage your eyes permanently, almost instantly. People have done experiments where they pointed binoculars at the sun and held a sheet of paper back where your face would be, and the paper ignited. So we don't want anybody to set their face on fire or burn out their eyes. It can happen almost instantly. Avoid the sun with binoculars. But that said, a good thing that you should look at, and perhaps your first target, should be the moon. The moon looks beautiful in binoculars, and my recollection of that first view I had of the moon, I felt like I was an airplane flying over the surface. It was just stunning. I couldn't believe that the family binoculars could do that wonderful a job with the moon. You can expect to see in binoculars mountains on the moon, craters, the basins and the maria, and be sure to look at the terminator. So the terminator is the line between the shaded dark side of the moon and the brightly lit sunlit side of the moon. Tonight we have a crescent. If you were to go out tonight and have a look at that crescent, the bright side will have some interesting features to it, but the best observing will be along the terminator. And again, they're portable. The binoculars are portable, no setup time. Just pop outside and have a look. The important points, again, with this moon thing is to stabilize those binoculars, get them focused properly. The moon will look very bright in the binoculars. After all, you're delivering quite a few times more light to your eyes than normal. But you won't damage your eyes. The moon will be bright. It will not hurt you. So maybe after you have looked at the moon with your binoculars, you can move on to the planets. And the brighter planets in binoculars look like bright dots, or maybe disks, or maybe small circles. The point being that they're not exactly like points of light, like the stars. And this is something you'll need to learn to distinguish in your observing so that you can help identify the difference between planets and stars. So if we agree that the planets, the brighter ones, look like small disks, if you look at Mars, it has some color to it. It looks pale orange. Now, I know we call it the red planet, but it looks orange to me. It will look orange to you in binoculars. Jupiter is in the evening sky right now. It looks a creamy yellow. Saturn, also in the evening sky. It rises later than Jupiter, but it looks a pale yellow. And in fact, if you look at Saturn, I think it rises at 10 o'clock tonight, but if you can get a look at Saturn tonight, you'll notice that it isn't exactly circular. It looks a little bit elongated. And the reason that that is true is that you're seeing the rings. So as Saturn moves in its orbit and we move in our orbit, the inclination that we see of Saturn's rings changes. So right now, Saturn's at about 25 degrees inclination. So we can see the rings fairly easily. A few years from now, when the viewing arrangement changes, the rings of Saturn will look like they have gotten edge on to us, which means you're not going to see them in a telescope or binoculars, probably. And at that point, Saturn will look like a disk. But now, you will be able to tell that it's elongated. There's an oval there rather than a nice circle. Another thing you can see is the 4 Galilean moons of Jupiter. We did some observing of Jupiter a few weeks ago, and we could see all the moons. And in my binoculars, they look like points of light. They're really indistinguishable from stars. But the key thing about looking at Jupiter and its moons is you'll see those 4 stars, actually moons, lined up along Jupiter's equator. Some nights you won't see 4. Some nights you'll see 3 or maybe 2. And that's because maybe 1 or 2 of the moons are behind Jupiter where you can't see them. Or maybe they're in front of Jupiter, in fact, passing in front of Jupiter to our line of sight. And you won't be able to see that against the brightness of Jupiter. So have a look at Jupiter. Some nights you'll see 4 moons. Some other nights you'll see fewer. And then the last thing that you should be able to see on the brighter planets is the phases of Venus. Right now, I think Venus is at 70%. So that's a pretty gibbous phase. It's going to look pretty much circular to you. But when it gets to a crescent phase, you'll be able to tell the difference between the fuller phases of Venus and the more crescent phases of Venus. You can learn to identify that. So that's only a few of our planets. The other planets are not seen so well in binoculars because they're either too small or they're too dim. Mercury and Uranus are okay in binoculars. Mercury will look orange to you, but somewhat stellar. Uranus will look blue-green perhaps, but again, somewhat stellar. Neptune and Pluto are beginning to be too small and too dim. Neptune's at about magnitude 8 right now. So if you really know what you're looking for, you may be able to pick it up, but it's going to look like a star to you. Pluto right now is a little over magnitude 14. I don't think you're going to get that one with binoculars. Here again, if you are observing Mercury and Venus, be very careful with those binoculars if the sun is up. Don't get near the sun with those binoculars. My favorite thing to observe with binoculars is still comets. When comets are large objects, because they're traveling near the Earth, they're bright. And when they're large and bright, they really look best in binoculars. They get too large to fit in the eyepiece field of view. That doesn't mean you can't look at it with a telescope. You can certainly pick out detail around the nucleus, but to fit more than the nucleus of a comet in the field of view of a telescope becomes challenging. So when the comets are near to Earth, for heaven's sakes, grab some binoculars. You can definitely pick out the head of the comet with the binoculars. You can pick out the tail. You can pick out texture in the tail. So these are all things that you should look for. And even if a comet is further out and isn't sporting a nice tail, like Comet Lovejoy in January, that night we looked, the tail was barely discernible even in the 70 millimeter binoculars. but I could still see it, so it was a good view worth having. And once again, a dark location on a moonless night is really what you need to see, what you really need to be doing if you want to see this faint tail. The tail will be diffuse. It can be sort of bright against the background sky, but still you need a dark location. There are quite a few deep sky objects you can see fairly readily with binoculars, which is why we have people that have earned binocular awards in the club. Over the course of several years of putting together these binocular observing lists, I have noticed that a lot of these lists are loaded with open clusters. And that's because they look so darn good in binoculars. If you went out tonight and pointed binoculars at the Beehive cluster, which is M44, the view will be outstanding, like white diamonds on black velvet. It's really beautiful. A few weeks ago, we were out observing the night we were looking at Jupiter. I had a look at the Gemini and Auriga clusters. They are really outstanding, even in binoculars. They, you can tell that there's a hazy patch even in small binoculars, and larger binoculars you can begin to resolve the stars. And the same thing holds for globular clusters. Right now in the sky, M3 is a big, beautiful globular in Canis Venatici. And I would urge any of you to go have a look at that. M53 is a bit dimmer, but it also is in the night sky. And then, a couple of months from now, you can easily see M13 and M92 during the summer months up in Hercules. They are fantastic sights in binoculars. They look like countless points of light on a black background. The larger your aperture, the better resolving power you will have. So the larger binoculars you have, the better chance you have of resolving the points of light rather than just seeing the hazy patch. The smaller binoculars, it's going to look hazy to you. But I would urge you, if you can stabilize the binoculars, to take your time looking at something like that and see whether you can resolve those stars. And then, gosh, I couldn't give an observing talk without talking about the Lagoon and Trifid nebulae. They are wonderful to look at through binoculars. M42 is beautiful right now. Orion's setting in the west. If you can get your binoculars on any of those objects, they'll look like a smudgy patch of light. In the case of M8, you can see the open cluster embedded in the nebulosity. And here again, the larger aperture of your binoculars, the better your view will be. This is a nice little technique. Has anybody in here ever tried to put filters on your binoculars? I had never heard of this technique until many years ago. I was at the Winter Star Party, and my friend Tom Lorenzen was there, and we were talking about a planetary I had observed with my telescope recently called Jones 1. It's a dim little booger in Pegasus, I think. And he said, you know what? Take a look with these binoculars. So he handed me an 8x50 pair of Fujinon binoculars, and he had Lumicon UHC high contrast filters they're really meant for looking at nebula. I looked up, and sure enough, I could see Jones 1. I was astounded. I thought that my telescope was barely big enough to see Jones 1, but it turns out that I could see him through those binoculars in those dark skies with those filters. So if you have filters, consider putting them on your binoculars if you have threaded eyepieces. A contrast filter is going to look really nice with nebulae. Perhaps you have a broadband light pollution filter like a Lumicon Deep Sky. You try those on galaxies. If you happen to have a hydrogen beta filter set, try those. I'm sure that the California Nebula in Perseus would look gorgeous with those. I'd really like to have the opportunity to do that myself. The other thing, of course, you can look at with binoculars are stars. And again, of all these observing lists I've looked at over the years, I've noticed a lot of variable stars and double stars show up on those lists. So there's a lot of work with those that you can do with just binoculars. So the name of the game with variables is to determine what magnitude the variable happens to be at the moment. You're to judge the brightness of that star and record the time and so forth. The brightness of variable stars changes over time, of course, for different reasons. Sometimes it's an arrangement of stars reasons. Sometimes it's a physical process within the star. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were observing Nova Sagittarii in the morning over in the park in North Cary where we often have public sessions. So Mark was out imaging, and I took out these binoculars to see what I could see. And the name of the game has to be to judge the magnitude. Well, I found the nova without any problem at all, but then I had to judge the magnitude. And the way I did that was to look around in the field of view, first of all, of the binoculars, and didn't find a good candidate, didn't look around further in the constellation to find a star that looked like it was about the same brightness as the nova. And I did find one down in the right corner of Sagittarius. So I made a mental note of how things looked. I had my little voice recorder. I went home and I looked up that star's magnitude on a planetarium program I have. Luckily, that star is not a variable, and the magnitude was 5.2, I believe. So I had found another that was a little bit dimmer, and so I judged the magnitude of the nova that night to be 5.25. So I compared my observation with others made around the world about the same time, and it definitely fell within the range of, yeah, this is about right. So that's how you do the variable star thing with binoculars. And of course, nova is a great target to practice on. The other thing would be double stars. Many, if not most stars in our galaxy seem to come in multiples. They come in pairs or triples. And you can see these systems if they're bright enough, the components are bright enough, and the separation between the components is large enough for you to resolve with your binoculars. And of course, there are lots and lots of examples of these for you to work on. One terrific example is Albireo and Cygnus. In the summer sky, when Cygnus is high, look up at Albireo and you'll be able to see the components. And you should also learn to try to distinguish the colors of the stars in the system, if you can. And then you should also learn to judge the distance between the stars, if you can. So with all of that in mind, there are literally thousands of targets you can pursue with just binoculars, and of course, millions of stars. Binoculars are so capable. Don't underestimate them. And if you're able to see all this stuff, well, gee, wouldn't we all like to have a recommendation on what to look at when? So luckily, the two major American magazines carry articles about binocular observing. I don't know whether you noticed them or not. Astronomy magazine has an article roughly quarterly. It's usually written by Phil Harrington, and it's called Binocular Stargazing. This is a short, a long article. He usually gets maybe a dozen or more objects that he describes for you to observe over the quarter. Now, I expected to see this article in the April issue of Astronomy, and I didn't see it, so I'm not sure about the status of the article. Maybe they've changed the published schedule, maybe they've dropped it. I just don't know. But the other one that is definitely still showing up every month is in Sky and Telescope magazine. If you open Sky and Telescope to the star chart in the centerfold area of the magazine, you look at the top right corner of those pages, you'll see the binocular highlight article written by Gary Saronic. And in that, he usually details just a couple objects. So it's a short and quick list of things for you to pursue. Beyond the magazines, we have several popular observing books for binocular observers. The one that I use is called Touring the Universe Through Binoculars. You're welcome to come up and have a look at it. In this book, Phil Harrington discusses hundreds of objects. He gives you the magnitude and the separation for double stars and the size of things. Throughout the book, he gives you visual impressions of what you should expect to see. And it's just an all-around very good resource. A similar book, newer in publication, is Binocular Highlights by Gary Saronic. And I don't know for sure, but I rather suspect that it is a compendium of these articles that have shown up in the magazine for several years. Does anybody have that book by chance? Binocular Highlights by Gary Saronic. You do have it. Do you know whether it's a compendium of articles from the magazine?
What's that again?
Is it a collection of articles that appeared in the magazine?
The Binocular Highlights.
Yeah.
It just shows star charts just about.
Yeah, yeah.
Of different things you can
see. Yeah. Okay, and so then the third of these books is called Binocular Astronomy. And this is by Stephen Tonkin out of the UK. So this book is a little more expensive than the other two. It's recently published, but it's more expensive, I think, because it was published in the UK. It's an excellent resource. And then we have some online articles that are showing up monthly. First is Binocular Universe by Phil Harrington. It appears on cloudynights.com. And there he goes about 12 or so objects per month. He got really excited back in January and February, and there were like 70 objects in there. So in there, he'll show you a chart of where things are. He'll give you a little table of the information for each object. And he will describe his visual impression of these things. It's an excellent resource. The other resource that I know of is Tonkin's binocularsky.com website. And there he publishes a monthly newsletter with charts and everything, all types of objects, visual impressions, and so on. An excellent resource for you to try. And then we get down to the Astronomical League Observing Award programs. Now these are going to be more structured, and they will have rules and requirements for you to fulfill in order to earn the award. And the URLs are here for each of those programs. At this point, I probably should admit or confess that I put a small article on raleighastro.org that lists the URLs that I've mentioned in this talk. So it could be on there by now. It probably is. But if you go to raleighastro.org and look for the resources mentioned in Astronomy with Binoculars or something along those lines, it will list all these URLs and print and Kindle books. All that stuff will be listed there. So let me get to the final thought of the night, and that is maybe some of you have binoculars at home or a family member or something that look like they've really had it. Those binoculars have seen a better day. Such a pair of binoculars came my way several years ago when I was cleaning them out my mother's home. I came across a pair of binoculars, and they said Lights 7x50. And the serial number and so on were on there. And I thought, well, you know, these look like they could not work at all. But if anybody could get them working, maybe I can, so I'll take them. So they languished in my drawer for about 8 years. and back around Christmas time, I was cleaning out the cabinet. I ran across the binoculars and thought, you know what, I'm either going to see if these will work for me or I'm going to get rid of them. So I took these binoculars to dinner one night and showed them to my friend Jim Presley, who has a lot of knowledge about binocular optics and mechanical function. And showed them to him, and I showed them to Bob Wolk, who is not here tonight, I think. He's an avid birder, so he's a very critical eye with binoculars also. So these guys looked through these binoculars and said, Phyllis, I think maybe you ought to get these fixed up if you can, because the optics look kind of sharp. So at that point, I thought, well, I'm going to write to Leica Company, who used to be Lights, they're Leica now, in Germany, and I'm going to find out when and where these binoculars were bought. So I sent an email off with serial number. A few days later, I got an email back. And the email contained a photocopy of a handwritten sales log. These binoculars were sold to a U.S. Army officer in post-war occupation Germany in September of 1945. And I thought, eureka, I know exactly where these binoculars came from. My stepfather had joined the Army in 1945, and he was in post-war Germany. So I think that they saw some years in the Korean conflict, and maybe that's why they look so horrible. He was an artilleryman, so of course those guys use binoculars. So I started looking for somebody to repair and restore these things, because they needed a lot more than repair. They needed restoring. I happened upon a thread on cloudynights.com that mentioned Sudderth Optical Repair Company in Oklahoma. So I sent him, his name is Corey, I sent him an email and described my situation, sent him some photos. And he said, sure, I take care of that stuff all the time. Package them up, these are my services, you choose the ones you want, I'll take care of it. So I boxed them up and shipped them down there. And a few days later, like a week later, I got a before and after picture back of what work he had done. The picture on the left is the before picture. As you can see, doesn't have much paint on it. The skin is off the binoculars. What you can't tell from the picture is that the center axle barely moved. It was just about locked up. One of the focusers was just as stiff. You could barely move it. And if you look through the binoculars, you could see black specks of yuckiness inside the optics. And the front element on one side, you could see the cement between the lenses had deteriorated. It looked like maple syrup. So that's the condition I sent them in. And what I got back is the picture on the right. He completely reskinned them. He lubricated all the joints. He fixed the paint. He took all the optics apart and cleaned them. He took apart that nasty lens and re-cemented it. He put it all back together and recollimated it, sent them back to me. They work like new. So, gee whiz, folks, if you've got a nasty pair of binoculars in the drawer, don't write them off. They might be salvageable. Hang on. So that's it for the talk. Thank you so much for coming out. I hope I've had some resource or suggestion that you can use to go out and observe tonight, because there are a number of things in the sky tonight that are worth looking at. Start with the moon maybe, move on to the planets, and maybe on to the deep sky objects. So questions? Chris.
Yes, I have a question. I have a pair of, I guess it's Pentax. They've got good optics because of the bottom, but the annoyance, it's not an annoyance, I guess it's an inherent thing about when you have a separate focus for the left and the right. I can understand why you have that with binoculars, but I have a hard time harmonizing them. What's the best way to go about focusing binoculars to have the wheel in the middle for one of them, and then the other one has you twist the to get them to harmonize?
Well, I can tell you what I do. I'll take the individually focused side, and I'll shut the other eye, get that one focused, then I'll open the other eye and try the whole system. Anybody have another technique for that particular type of hardware? Jim?
That's about the, like I said, that's about the same. You can close off one eye,
right,
focus the individual, then close off the other one, and then focus again, and then you can get it. Or actually, take the left side and focus it first with the right side closed, the one with the adjustable diopter, and then close off the left eye, and then adjust the turn mechanism to get both eyes completely sharp.
Okay, next question. Oh, did that do it?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's just a matter of getting up and fussing with it a little bit. But
yeah, I think once you get the hang of the focus system, you're there.
it just seems to me that
With sharp optics, even with sharp optics, it's harder to focus binoculars than it is a telescope.
I think it's just a matter of practice.
excuse me, folks, for the people that are on that are watching it, we'd like to be able to hear the questions, and everybody that grabs the mic, and it's a natural reaction. You all take it and push it down here so you can't hear the speakers. You realize it's not coming through, so you really have to get the mic close, and you may have to hear yourself to the speaker. So sorry to interrupt.
Yes, Don.
Okay, just a couple of points. Howie Glatter, I talked to him over at NEAP about, I think it was 3 years ago, the one when they had the birds there, and he sells custom fit nebula filters, and you got a choice of some filters that fit your binoculars in the eyepiece cup. You have to give them some dimensions or send it to them, but they're not cheap. I think they're about $150, but you can see some fantastic stuff. One thing I forgot, I should, my cheekbone beat me up on this, and I regret it. There was a pair of binoculars. They were, I think they were either 25 by 100 or, I think they were 25 by 100, but they were Russian, and they had flip-in deep sky filters. But I didn't buy them for $150 because the eyepieces needed some work. They were flopping around. You get vertical displacement. I wish I'd bought those. But another thing on deep sky objects, I've got a pair of fairly recently acquired 20 by 80 Orion binoculars. And they're the some of the older ones with the individual focus. I love those things. It's a very good binocular, but I found on looking, has a 3.1 degree field. The Andromeda Galaxy is 3 degrees. Now, if you put that on a stand and look at the Andromeda Galaxy, most people that come up will see the little thing smudge in the middle, and that's all they see. But if you hand hold it, as you bounce, and it's good exercise, what you'll, the motion of it, all of a sudden you see the central bulge, and you see this whole big dinner plate in motion that's going with it, because your brain will paint that out because it sees the central smudge and it doesn't see the rest of it. But it is vivid, and it's if we're transmitting it, one of the people that looked through it, I won't repeat his comment, but it's a good contest to some of the comments that I've made over the years. But there's another thing too. If you're looking at the moon, you can also stop it down. A 15 by 60 pair that I had modified some lens caps out of some the food containers. Had aluminum at the bottom, about 1 inch in diameter, and looking at the moon, it is just fantastic. So moon is a little too bright with binoculars, that knocks the brightness down, and it also helps get it away from scattered light on the edges of the prisms.
A quick question, Phyllis. I missed part of the talk, but I don't know if you spoke anything about BAK4 prism glass versus BAK7. I've tried both. I really can't see much of a difference between the two. I know that everyone wants BAK4 prism glass in their binoculars, but I don't know. Have you ever tried to? I looked at the refractive index. It's like only like 0.375 difference. It's not much. Anyways, I just thought I'd see if you had a comment on that.
The answer is no, I haven't, but I would bet that there are some in here that have. Yeah, you.
I brought some show and tell stuff. I'll make it quick.
Okay. Oh yes, a parallelogram mount.
This is a drywall sander that I bought at Lowe's. I put a bungee cord on it, which you can see the hole spring extended. The drywall sander already has a loop on it so that you can strap the binoculars in very quickly. Now the only problem is it's kind of floppy. You got to hold on to it, but it does take the weight off your arms. And this is a parallelogram I made out of, again, stuff I bought at Lowe's. Didn't cost very much, $70. I didn't tighten it.
Forward just a bit, Dave?
Pardon me?
Can you move it forward just a bit so the camera picks it up?
Okay.
No, he wants you to pick it up and bring it in.
Oh, I can do that, but I have to make the problem.
Perfect, stop, perfect. Okay.
The tripod's not the best. I think a camera tripod would work better. But it does work, and you can, as you can see, the binoculars point the same direction no matter what you do. And total weight is just a pipe cap and a pipe sleeve with a hole drilled in it and some junk metal inside for weight.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave.
Also, get you a Studio Manfrotto tripod. Those are outstanding. It's about 4 to 5 feet high, but then it has a 21-inch column throw. I've been using one since 1998, and you can get a wide variety of heights from a rather tall person looking at something straight up even to a shorter person. Also, I found that if you've got a binocular on a camera, you can, or on a camera tripod, a good strong tripod, you can focus easier by focusing on some of the dimmer stars. And you can even put a digital camera behind there and take a picture too. I like to compare binoculars to unaided eyes as well as a telescope. I like to describe a binocular as being like a magnifying glass for the sky, and a telescope as being like a microscope. And then one item I've got from the old show and tell thing you might think of is, we set this. You don't want to forget in your binocular targets, glorious Orion. This is how it would look with, say, just the unaided eye in the city. Now, let's go out into a dark sky area, and with just a simple pair of binoculars, it can look like this. You can see a whole big difference. But you may wonder, but what about a telescope? If you notice the little circles on here, I'll show a telescope view, and then you see how much more the binocular covers of the sky. You can get big, grand views of the sky through binoculars. But with a telescope, you see much less of the sky. But when you magnify the image size, and then you also magnify the light, you see a whole lot more as well, too. And the binoculars are also outstanding for observing lunar planetary conjunctions like the moon with Venus and Jupiter, like that occurred on December the 1st, 2008. And then, of course, all kinds of other stuff, too, that you can see, too, that you can't see with a telescope due to the field of view coverage.
Okay, thanks a lot, Frank. And any last questions to wrap this up?
Just one more comment. Frank talked about making digital images with your binoculars. You can take the, you can buy the Orion cell phone adapter for a telescope and actually fit that on your ocular and make digital pictures with that. So it's really, really easy to adapt.
Chris, yeah.
I just wanted to comment that one of the things I use the binoculars for, in addition to clear nights like tonight, I'll have them out, and maybe even on microscopes in my driveway, but there's nights that you just think, oh gosh, it's too cruddy up there. They're just little tiny sucker holes, or it just looks too hazy. Take your binoculars out there, and sometimes it just gawk. There's actually a lot more up there when you think there's only a half dozen stars you can see. There's actually stuff up there to look at, even if you can't say what it is.
Yeah, and it's not quite as much trouble as lugging the equipment out.
Exactly. Touch that up, except to open the doorknob.
Just go.
No, it's statements like that. Just like, I have all this expensive stuff, and the next thing I need is a robot that will put my stuff together for me. But in regards with this, what we're talking about here, I think one of the neatest experiences I ever had, there was a gentleman that was on a ferry ride with us going from Ocracoke to Cedar Island. And on that boat ride, it was crystal clear. And everybody knows when you get out to the Outer Banks, it gets pretty darn dark. And this was like during the summertime. And so this guy, he had no real experience with, astronomical objects. And I was like, oh, God, you got to let me borrow those binoculars. And I looked around and everything, and he was like, what are you looking at? I said, well, you know that's the Milky Way right there. And he's like, yeah. I was like, here, take a look at this. And Trifid and Lagoon, I mean, like you said, if you're in a really dark place, the things just like, just blaze. Whereas if you're like out at our dark place at Big Woods, yeah, it's pretty dark compared to like here in the city. But you get to someplace very dark, yeah, binoculars. You just want to do some casual viewing. That's all it takes.
Really.
Just some binoculars, a pair of binoculars.
I agree very much. Okay, so I guess that'll do it.
Okay, so one last thing I'll say is I didn't do Phyllis justice when I introduced her, and just want to point out that she's the author of the Deep Sky Planner application for planning your observing, and also the proud owner of a very large teeter dog telescope. So thanks for coming out tonight. We really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
After meetings, we usually go out to trips. Take trips over off Wade Avenue to do dinner. If y'all want to do that, raise your hands and we can call it in. About 10 or 12 people. So we'll call it in. So I guess that's it for tonight. Thanks a lot.
I got a picture of Venus through the binoculars.
And you got the crescent phase.
That was a 16-hour magnified to 3x on the camera.
I don't think people realize that you can do that.
Thank
Hello.
you, Phyllis. That was great.
You're welcome. You're so welcome.
I had joined a year ago here with the idea that I was going to conduct challenge.